Airborn by Kenneth Oppel. Illustrated by Antonio Javier Capero. Matt Cruz is a cabin boy aboard the futuristic airship Aurora. The Aurora stays afloat using a gas called hydrium. One day, Matt spots a damaged sky balloon with an old man named Benjamin Malloy inside. Malloy has fallen ill and is rambling on about beautiful creatures he saw in the sky. With Malloy unable to communicate clearly, Matt and Malloy's granddaughter, Kate, have only his journal entries to guide them on their mission to figure out whether these flying creatures are real or imagined. The journal's spine was cracked and flabby, and there was a hair ribbon around the book, holding it all together. Moths danced around in my stomach as I climbed up to my bunk and stretched out. My cabin mate, Baz, was on crow's nest duty until 4. I turned on my reading lamp. I untied the ribbon and carefully turned back the cover. The pages were all scabby, as if the book had been soaked by rain, then baked in the sun. The pages were covered with small, neat lines of ink. Date, position, wind speed, altitude, observations. There was a little preface telling about how he, Benjamin Malloy, planned to do a complete west to east circumnavigation of the globe in his hot air balloon. I read quickly over these first pages, not because they weren't interesting, but because I could see Kate's bookmark up ahead, and it made my stomach feel swirly, wondering what was written there. It was hard to concentrate on the stuff beforehand. Kate's grandfather had started out in Cape Town to catch the jet stream and traveled quickly eastward over the Indian Ocean. But over Australia, his luck ran out, and he got shunted off course to the northeast. There was no sign of panic in his log. His days were busy with keeping the balloon shipshape, managing his supplies and provisions, taking weather readings and bearings. He described the countries and landscapes he was sailing over. Some days, there were just coordinates and weather conditions. Other days, he had lots to write about. Birds, the changing light, the landscape of the passing nations beneath him, the creatures below the ocean's surface. He seemed interested in everything. I was keeping an eye on his coordinates and realized he was drifting along a flight path not too far off the Aurora's route from Sydney to Lionsgate City. With every day, his course veered more to the east as he tried to catch favorable winds at different altitudes. Not for the first time, I felt a sense of dread for him. I loved being aloft, but to be completely at the mercy of the winds with no other means of power or steerage, it was a frightening thought. Obviously, Kate's grandfather had a stouter heart than mine. Panic. Panic is a feeling of strong fear that leaves someone unable to think clearly. Favorable. Something that is favorable, gives a benefit, or contributes to success. I lost track of how long I'd been reading. I was so caught up in the day-to-day journey. There weren't a lot of clues, but little bits of the man crept through, even in his log. He liked watching the weather. He hated the tinned baked beans, but ate them because they were nutritious and portable. He enjoyed Shakespeare. He loved his granddaughter. He mentioned her often in his log. Must remember to tell Kate, he wrote, or will send Kate a postcard when I set down in Cape Town. With a start, I realized that Kate's bookmark was just a page's turn away. I put the journal down, climbed off my bunk, and went down the corridor to the bathroom. At the sink, I splashed cold water on my face. Not that I was sleepy. It just seemed like the thing to do when you were up in the wee hours of the morning reading the log of a strange, doomed voyage. Back in the cabin, I slid down into the warm furrow of my bunk and took a glimpse at the stars outside my porthole. With a deep breath, I picked up the journal and turned the page. September 2nd, 1523. An island in the distance, 171 degrees 43 minutes west, 2 degrees 21 minutes north, veiled in mist. Possibly volcanic, given the cone-shaped silhouette it presents. It looks like a tropical place, with a crescent-shaped beach behind a green lagoon and densely forested. Sighted 2 albatross foraging over the ocean, plucking fish and squid from the water's surface with their long hooked beaks. Porthole. A porthole is a small round window on a ship. Densely. If something is covered densely, the covering is so thick that it is difficult to see through. 1745. Closer to island now. Huge flock of albatross in distance. Most unusual to see so many together. Perhaps island is nesting ground. Their coloring is odd. No dark coloration on their wingtips or bodies. Their plumage seems a misty white, so that against cloud and sky they are scarcely visible. Only when they are against the ocean or the island can I make them out with any clarity. 1802. Not birds.
You can see he's seeing them for a pretty far distance according to this picture. And he thought they were birds, but then at 1802 he says, not birds. These 1802, 1745, these are time. This is military time.
It sent a tingle through me, those 2 words, and I had to look up from the book. I imagined Benjamin Malloy peering through his spyglass, his hand tightening around the gondola's rim. What was it he'd seen that told him these creatures weren't birds? Their wings are not feathered. I was mistaken about their beaks. They have none. Considerably bigger than either magnificent frigate birds or albatross. One of the creatures broke from the flock and made a slow circle of the Endurance, quite high at first, then spiraling down closer to the gondola. It seemed very curious. Its body is easily 6 feet in length and closely furred. Its forelegs seem to turn into wings, like a bat's, with a single protruding claw at the wing's leading edge. The span I would estimate as 8 or 9 feet across. Its rear legs are stubby, but with wickedly sharp curved claws. I feared for the balloon should he collide with it. How can such a creature stay aloft? It looks too heavy. It is fiercely agile in the sky, dipping and spinning and diving with ease. Its wings infinitely versatile. It fairly seems to leap through the air. Saw scarcely anything of its face. A gleam of sizable incisors on upper and lower jaws. A flash of intelligent green-flecked eyes. Then it veered off, hurtling back toward its fellows. An undiscovered species? I turned the page, and there was a picture, a pencil sketch. Just looking at it made my heart flutter, and I had to sit up and catch my breath. He put the rim of the basket in the foreground, and the silhouette of the island in the background to give a sense of scale. The creature's wingspan was huge. He was a deft hand, the grandfather, that was certain. Couldn't have had much time to get it down, but his lines were swift and assured. It was the strangest looking thing, half bird, half panther. September 4th, 1325. I have dropped into a calmer stratum of air, so I can hover over the island and observe them. They float. They face into the wind and scarcely need beat their wings. I watched one move not a muscle for hours, sleeping maybe, bedded down on the air itself. They cannot weigh much.
So you can see here, this is his airboat, and this is the creature he's talking about. That's how large it is. It's way larger than his airship.
Across the next 2 pages were drawings of skeletons. The first one was human. I saw that clearly enough. The rib cage, the hips, the skull atop the neck. Next to it was a skeleton that looked at first glance not so very much different, except the hands. The bones of the fingers were all long and flared. It was freakish to look at, until I read Benjamin Malloy's caption underneath. Bat. Next to this was a third skeleton, and it seemed some sort of bizarre combination of the two. Shortened legs like the bat, and instead of arms, the same weirdly flared finger bones of the bat. But the skull on this one was no bat's, nor was it human. The skull was flatter, with sharp teeth. Smaller, yes, but certainly no one would mistake this for a bat, and never for a bird. The drawings were made with scientific care, all shaded and with a length scale to the side. He was a clever man, Kate's grandpa. No questioning that. Seemed to know something about everything. Underneath were all sorts of Latin words. September 5th, 0915. Still playing the air currents around the island so I can watch them. They have a great curiosity for my balloon, circling high, but rarely drawing too close to the gondola. Difficult for me to see their bodies or faces more clearly. They seem wary of me. The sight of my spyglass makes them scatter in an instant. I wonder why. With a start, I realized that these creatures could have been responsible for damaging his balloon. Had they tested the material with their sharp claws, torn enough little gashes to make it sink? 1747. They do not land. In all the time I've been observing, they haven't landed in the trees or on the water. They feed low over the island, preying on all manner of birds. They are voracious hunters. They also eat fish, strafing the water and plunging their rear claws into the sea as they break. They come up with fish or small squid. They lift them high, then flip them up to their mouths and take them whole. Sometimes they drop their prey and then dive down and snatch it into their mouths. September 6th, 1117. I have counted 26 of the creatures. I wish Kate could see them, the way they gambol and swirl through the air. I've never seen an animal look so at home in its element. Like dolphins or porpoises or whales, they clearly love to play. Why has no one ever seen these before? Their natural camouflage is excellent, but with so many airships aloft now, surely someone else must have seen these creatures. Or are there very few? Are these the only ones in existence? On the next page was another sketch of a great flock, or a herd, I wasn't sure what to call them, of these things circling over the coast of the island. September 7th, 1340. They birth in the air. One after another, one of the creatures, a female I now realize, would soar to a great altitude, 7,000 feet or so. I increased my lift so I could rise with them and keep watch. The female put her head to the wind and angled her wings so she was hovering. Then something dropped from her hindquarters. It happened so quickly, all I was aware of was a small dark bundle plunging away from her. At first, I thought it was merely her droppings, but I quickly realized it was too large, and the female's behavior was most curious. Immediately, she went into a dive too, keeping pace with the falling object. The object wobbled in the air and seemed to enlarge, even as it fell past me. It was spreading its wings. It was no bigger than a kitten, but its wings, as they unfurled, were many times the width of its body. Out went the wings, instinctively angled so that the newborn's plunge began to slow dramatically. After a moment or two, I saw the wings lift and push tentatively, then again and again, each time with more force. It was flying. From the moment of birth, it knew how. How could such a thing be possible? Incredible. But then, does not the newborn whale, born into the element of water, know instantly how to swim? Why could it not be so with this creature then? Only air and not water was its element. The mother flew close alongside its child, as if giving advice, monitoring its progress. I watched more females make the climb to the birthing altitude and then release their newborns into the air. September 8th, 1251. All are feeding today with a new kind of urgency. Are they on some kind of migration? I wonder where they're going, where they come from. I suppose the sky is their home. They need no terrestrial haven. Perhaps they simply move from hemisphere to hemisphere looking for the warmest skies, and the birthing season coincides with the arrival in southern latitudes. 1935. They're departing. Would like to follow, but they're too fast. With tailwinds, I would estimate 80 knots. Amazing creatures. Gone now. Weather changing. Maybe it was me, but I thought he sounded pretty dejected. When I turned the page, I felt a bit queasy. Most of the handwriting was smeared by torrential rain, I supposed, and I could make out only a few words. It seemed a tropical storm had overtaken him and kept him in its fist for some time. I think I saw the word damage in one entry, and a mention of a problem with the envelope. A hot flush swept my back. Was he leaking? Had the creatures torn his balloon, or was it just the storm? Benjamin Malloy had stopped dating his entries, and his coordinates and weather observations seemed half-hearted now. His handwriting was all tilted, the letters slewing into one another. I remembered that we'd found him on September 13th, so that left 5 days after his last dated entry. I wondered if he'd now fallen ill, too weak to repair his ship or keep his log properly. There were some more sketches of the creatures, and then, suddenly the sketches became stranger, covering more and more of the pages. Creatures with the faces of lions or eagles or women. Creatures with human faces and furred bodies and wings, that even not fully extended dwarfed their bodies. These were imagining, surely, for they were so different from his earlier sketches, but drawn with such detail you'd have thought he'd had them right before his eyes. There was only one more written entry in the log. Airship in the distance. Will signal for help. I looked for the date, but found none. It must have been the aurora he'd sighted, but I'd certainly seen no signal from his gondola. I stared at that last page for a while, the final words, the nothingness after it, and it got me feeling strange, so I had to close the book. I felt a keen disappointment. It was hard to know what to make of it all. At first, the log had been so clear and reasonable, but by the end, especially with those pictures, it seemed he was dreaming. When did the real end and the conjurings of a disturbed mind begin? It was pushing 2 a.m. now, and I felt thoroughly ill at ease. I put the book on the shelf and eventually slept. Reasonable. If something is reasonable, it is logical and easy to understand. I woke feeling as if I hadn't slept at all, head thrumming like a symphony. I sprang off the bunk, eager to get the journal back to Kate and talk to her. But it wasn't until lunch that I had a chance. At breakfast, I was serving, and Kate's chaperone, Miss Simpkins, was at the table the whole time. And then she whisked Kate out before I could even hand her the journal. Then there was the clearing up and the preparing for lunch. Around midday, we were passing over the Hawaiis, and the captain slowed down and took us lower so the passengers could get a good look. On other trips, we sometimes made stops, but this was a direct passage, so everyone had to content themselves with peering down at the lush foliage and hearing the shriek of macaws and spider monkeys and toucans and cockatoos. The heady scent of the island's flowers reached us even at 100 feet. We were close enough so people on the ground waved and cheered, and bathers on the beach shielded their eyes with tanned hands, to look up at the great ship as it painted its massive shadow over the sand and water. We were cruising over the outer islands when the captain entered the lounge grinning. "Ladies and gentlemen, a point of interest. Off the starboard side, we're passing Mount Mataras, and, if I'm not mistaken, she is about to erupt." Nearly everyone put down their forks and knives and rushed to the windows. In the distance was the island with its volcano, a great heap of stone, looking more like the devil's anvil than anything, despite the green hue of its lush vegetation. Great puffs of gray smoke were billowing up from its jaws and getting darker by the second. "There she blows!" shouted Baz. Black bits of rock came shooting out from the cone, and the sound hit us a second later, a deep, thunderous vibration that passed through the entire ship and rattled the windows. We were upwind of it, or we would have been choking on the ash and smoke it was venting high into the sky. Soon, the volcano was spitting out orange and red sparks, and then a glutinous tongue of black and orange lava oozed over the crater's rim and started a leisurely slide down the slope, incinerating everything in its path. Good thing this was an uninhabited island. Amazing, isn't it? I glanced over, and Kate was beside me. She was looking out the window, but I knew she wasn't talking about the volcano. There was no sign of Miss Simpkins, and there was no one else around us. Everyone was watching the eruption, talking and pointing excitedly and snapping pictures. "Incredible," I said, and faltered, uncertain what to say next. I took the journal from my inside breast pocket and passed it to her. "Thank you." "You don't believe it," she said coldly. "I'm not saying that. It's just, I'm not altogether certain your grandpa really knew what he was seeing." "How can you say that? He spent days watching them and taking down notes like a scientist. He couldn't have made up all these things, not in such detail." It did seem an awful lot to imagine, even if he was delirious. I remembered his drawings. A weak, shaking hand couldn't have spun those lines. He always saw them from a distance, I pointed out. True, but think what he saw. The feeding, the birthing. Those pictures toward the end. I had traversed the skies over Atlanticus and Pacificus, and never had I seen such creatures. How to tell her that her grandpa had been ill, and his fevered brain had projected these things on thin air for his failing eyes to see? I thought of all her camera equipment, her bottles of chemicals, and could not find it in my heart to speak the plain truth. "You think like the others," she said, and there was a new hardness in her voice. "I think your grandfather was unwell and saw things maybe," I added. All the friendly light in her eyes had frosted away, and it made me feel sick. "No, he saw them. He'd been watching them for days." She clenched the journal in both hands, knuckles white. "He was sick by then, I suppose," she said. "But maybe he didn't mean us to think those last drawings were real. He was just imagining. Your grandpa's not the first to see such things. They're called sky kelpies. You see them from time to time, reflections on the water mostly. All sorts of weird atmospheric things. Airshipmen used to report them all the time. It's like how sailors used to think there were mermaids. They were just porpoises and narwhals and such." I could see she didn't like this much. I was insulting her. But what else could I say? I was just telling her the facts. "Maybe you should talk to the captain about it," I suggested. "I'm sure he'd talk with you, miss." Captain Walken surely must have read the journal last year when we took the gondola on board. I wondered that he'd never spoken of the strange things it contained, but of course he wouldn't have. He would never have divulged the contents of another captain's log to any but the relevant officers and authorities. Delirious. When someone is delirious, he or she is confused due to fever or illness. Projected. Something that is projected may appear to be real, but is not. Contents. The contents of a document are the topics or subjects it includes. I don't need to talk to the captain about it. I expect I'd get much the same as what I've just heard from you. It's not that I haven't looked, I blurted out as she turned to leave. I've looked for all sorts of things. You can take my word on it. Every flicker in the sky, I shook my head. I've never seen anything, but I'd love to. What your grandpa described is amazing. It sent shivers across my belly and then up into my armpits. Me too, she said, nodding with a frown. That tingly feeling. I get it every time I read it, and I've read it 100 times now. All the passengers in the lounge, including Miss Simpkins, luckily, were still crowded around the windows, riveted by the eruption. The volcano was putting on quite a show. Half the island was aflame now, lava crackling and steaming as it poured into the water. Have you shown the journal to anyone else? I asked her. Your parents, surely. I saw her nostrils narrow as she sucked in an angry breath. They're embarrassed by the whole business. Mother always thought he was odd. The traveling, the balloons, just silly. They always thought he was a bit of a nutter. Hallucinations, that's what they said. Let's just forget the whole thing. That's why I had to send the letter to the Zoological Society myself. I blinked. I couldn't let my parents stop this from getting out to the world. This is a major discovery, a new animal. I wrote them a letter describing more or less what my grandfather saw and asked them if they'd care to see a facsimile of his journal. Did they reply? Oh, yes. From her handbag, she produced a letter. It was a folded square, the creases so worn you could tell she'd folded and unfolded it many times. I could imagine her face when she read it, getting mad all over again. It wasn't a long letter, and I read it quickly. Dear Miss DeVries, thank you for your letter. We appreciate your taking the time to tell us about your grandfather's observations on his balloon voyage, namely, the sighting of some kind of winged mammal. We feel strongly that should such a creature exist, it would surely have been sighted and documented long ago. Every year, there are hundreds of unsubstantiated sightings of monstrous creatures in land, air, and sea. And we feel it is our duty as men of science to gently remind you that your grandfather was not trained. And in his state of health, he may have suffered additional deficiencies of observation.
Deficiencies. If something has deficiencies, it has weaknesses or flaws.
Additional deficiencies of observation, Kate scoffed, reading over my shoulder. They mean he was seeing things. The rest of the letter was the usual yours sincerely and thank you for your interest in the Zoological Society, etc., etc. It was signed Sir Hugh Snuffler. I saw him in my mind's eye, short and balding with a big loud voice. As if they've explored every inch of the planet, as if anyone has. And what about you? Kate fairly shouted. What about me? You've flown for years, yes? Well, 3. And how much of the actual sky have you traversed? Not much, when you put it that way. Exactly. Ships have their routes, and as you say, deviate from them only when necessary. That must leave millions and millions of miles of unexplored sky and sea. I imagine you're right, I said, nodding. And how long have airships really been flying? 50 years or so now? Hardly any time at all, in other words. So how can we possibly know they don't exist? Especially out here over the Pacificus, I said, surprising myself. The skyways and sea lanes are much less well-traveled compared to the Atlanticus. Exactly, she said, beaming. Do your parents know you wrote to the Zoological Society? Heavens, no. They would have locked me in my room without pen or paper. They'd have been mortified, telling someone outside the family, spreading his mad rantings. Question is this all imagination or real? The coordinates he wrote down for the island. Do we pass over them? I'd have to check, but I think not. Will you check, though? Yes, I said. And if we don't pass over, will you tell me when we'll be nearest the spot? I'll do that. Will you really? She seemed amazed. Yes. Grandpa thought they were migrating, and this is the same time of year. We could see them. I thought of her fancy camera. And what if you get a picture? What do you do with it? I'll send it directly to Sir Hugh Snuffly Nose at the Zoological Society. That'll set him straight. I laughed. I'm sure it will, miss. I wish you wouldn't call me miss. What should I call you? Kate, of course. If I start calling you Kate now when it's just the two of us, I might slip up in public, and that'd be seen as impertinent. Silly rules. People like you invented them, not me. Good point, she said appreciatively, a thoughtful crease in her brow. Really good point. Here's what I'll do, I said. When I get off duty, I'll check the charts and find out when we'll be closest. Thank you. I just hope it's during daylight. I hope you see them, I said. I really do.